Montana Territory, June of 1879, the wind carried dust and silence across the cracked earth beside Dry Creek, and the only sound was the slow clop of hooves until Yates Truman pulled his horse to a stop. He saw her there, slumped beside the dry bed like a dropped doll, her dress torn, boots caked with mud, and one hand still curled around the saddlebag she must have dragged for miles. Her hat was missing. The sun had blistered her shoulders. She looked up, blinking hard like she was not sure if he was real. "Ma'am," Yates swung down from his gelding, voice low but steady. "Are you hurt?" The woman tried to rise but swayed. "Water," she rasped. He handed her his canteen without a word. She drank too fast, coughed, and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Her eyes flicked up to his green, sharp even through the exhaustion. "Name's Yates Truman," he said, crouching beside her. "What happened out here?" "I am Liora Hale," she said, voice shaking but clear. "They took the wagon, left me behind." Yates's jaw tightened. "Who?" "3 men. I do not know their names. We were headed for Helena. They said they would guide me. Took my horse, my supplies." She hesitated, then added, "Everything." He looked at her, really looked. She was no prairie girl. Her dress had once been fine, Eastern-made, but now it was torn at the hem and stained. Her hands were blistered, nails broken. Still, she sat straight. There was something proud in her eyes, even now. "Are you alone out here?" he asked. Liora hesitated. "Yes." Yates nodded once. He did not press. "Can you ride?" She looked at his horse, then back at him. "I will." He helped her up behind his saddle, her hands gripping his waist as he guided the gelding away from the creek. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the hills, but they rode hard for a while before he turned them toward a narrow canyon he knew. A small camp waited there, nothing fancy, just a tent, a fire ring, a lean-to for his horse. As he helped her down, she winced. "You are hurt," he said. "Not bad." She pressed her hand to her side. "Just sore." Yates did not argue. He pulled out a blanket and laid it near the fire pit. "Sit, I will make coffee." Liora sat with her knees tucked close, eyes darting. Yates did not push her to speak. He brewed coffee in silence, the smell rising with the first flickers of flame. When he handed her the tin cup, her hands shook. "Thank you," she said. He nodded again. "You got anyone waiting in Helena?" She stared into the fire. "No, family." She hesitated. "Gone." Yates did not ask more. He had seen too many women torn up by the world to press. Instead, he turned his attention to the stew pot. "I was heading to Bozeman," he said after a while. "Cattle drive, but I have time." She looked at him sharply. "You do not have to help me." "I know," he said. "But I will." Liora watched him through the firelight. "Why?" Yates looked up from cutting dried beef. "Because you were left beside a dry creek with nothing but grit in your throat and fire in your eyes, and that is not how a person ought to be left." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then quietly, "I used to live in Chicago." He waited. "My father died last winter, left me nothing but debt and a house the bank took. I sold what I could, the rest I packed in that wagon." She looked down at her hands. "I thought I could start over." Yates stirred the pot. "You still can." Her lip trembled, but she pressed it into a hard line. "I do not know where to go now." "Then ride with me for a while," he said. "You will figure it out." That night, when she lay beneath the stars on a borrowed blanket, Liora stared up at the sky until the fire burned down. Yates sat quiet nearby, whittling something in the glow. He did not speak unless she did. He did not look at her like she was broken. She slept better than she had in days. The next morning, she helped saddle the horse without being asked. Her fingers were clumsy, but she was determined. They rode west through low grass and stone-dotted hills. Liora learned to balance better. She asked questions about the land, and Yates answered in short, steady words. That afternoon, they passed an abandoned homestead. A roof caved in, wildflowers overtaking the porch. Liora stared at it as they rode by. "Looks like it used to be loved," she said. Yates glanced over. Most places were once. Later, when they stopped near a stream, Liora walked barefoot into the water, letting it wash the dust from her feet. Yates sat on a rock, arms folded, watching her with quiet eyes. "I do not think I have laughed in weeks," she said as she splashed water over her arms. "You will," he said. She turned to him. "You always this sure about things?" "No," he said simply. "But I am sure about this." She stepped back to the bank, water dripping from her fingertips. About what? That you are not done yet, and whoever left you behind made a damn fool mistake. Liora looked at him, then not just at his face, but into him. His broad shoulders, weathered hands, the way he spoke plain but meant every word, something shifted. That night when they made camp again, she sat closer to him by the fire. When he passed her the coffee, their fingers brushed, neither pulled away. They rode like that for days, sharing silence and small stories. Yates told her about his mother's old piano, long gone in a fire. She told him about the lake near her childhood home, how it froze so thick in winter you could walk across it. He never asked if she was all right. He just made space for her to be. One morning she woke early and found him already up, staring east toward the rising sun. "Why are you awake so early?" she asked, pulling her shawl around her. Yates turned to her, eyes soft. "Could not sleep." She stepped beside him. "Thinking about you mostly." She froze, heart thudding. He turned toward her fully, his voice low. "I have not known you long, but I have not met anyone like you before." Liora swallowed. "I was just trying to survive." "I know," he said. "But there is more to you than that." She stepped closer. "You saved me. You saved yourself," he said. "I just showed up." Liora reached for his hand. He took it, warm and solid in hers. "I do not know where this road goes," she said. "Neither do I," he said. "But I would rather ride it with you." She smiled, then really smiled, the first time in weeks. "Then let us ride." Fingers still twined, they walked back to the fire, the dawn spilling light across the hills behind them. They stood side by side, the world quiet and wide, and ahead of them lay nothing but sky and open trail, and they were not alone anymore. Yates led the gelding into a narrow valley where the grass held a deeper green and the wind quieted. They'd left the scrub behind hours ago. The trail dipped between cottonwoods and the air took on the scent of damp bark. There was no sign of other travelers, just the hush of moving water and the rhythm of hooves on soft earth. Liora rode steady now, her balance sure behind him. She hadn't asked him to slow once that morning, though the trail cut sharp in places and the saddle rubbed raw at the seams of her dress. She kept her chin high and her eyes forward. Yates pulled up near a crooked fence made of driftwood and old wagon slats. Beyond it stood a cabin, weathered gray and half swallowed by wild rose bushes. A woman stepped out with a rifle across her arm but lowered it quick when she saw him. "Wasn't expecting you," she called, brushing a braid over her shoulder. "Didn't plan to come," Yates said. "But your stew's better than trail biscuits." The woman grinned, then caught sight of Liora and straightened. "You bringing company now?" Yates dismounted and helped Liora down. "This is Liora Hale." "Liora, that's Ruthie Baird. She runs this place and keeps me from starving when I wander too far." Ruthie looked Liora over, not unkindly. "You're welcome to sit. I've got rabbit on the fire." Liora nodded with quiet grace. "Thank you." Inside, the cabin was cool and smelled of thyme. Ruthie poured water from a clay jug and set out mismatched bowls. Yates sat near the hearth while Liora rested across from him, her back straight despite the wear of the ride. "You come west for land or for running?" Ruthie asked, not rude, just direct. Leora's hands stilled around the bowl. "I came for a beginning. It didn't go as I hoped." That's the usual story. Ruthie didn't press more than that. They ate in silence for a while, the sound of spoons tapping against tin the only conversation. Afterward, Yates stepped outside to tend the horse. Liora followed, her boots crunching soft over the gravel path. "He's different with you," Ruthie said, wiping her hands on her apron. Liora paused at the door. "How do you mean?" "He's a good man, always steady. But I've never seen him carry anyone else's silence like it was his own." Liora didn't answer, but her eyes lingered on him as he brushed down the gelding. They stayed the night in the barn loft, Ruthie having offered it without question. Liora curled in the straw, wrapped in a quilt, while Yates leaned against the beam near her, his hat pulled low. She turned toward him in the dark. "Why don't you ever ask what they did to me?" Yates answered after a long pause. "Because I reckon you'll tell me what matters. And what they did ain't who you are." A breath left her chest like something uncoiled. She didn't speak again, but sleep came easier in that quiet space. The next morning they left with Ruthie's dried apples packed in cloth and a tin of lard biscuits tucked into Yates's saddlebag. Ruthie hugged Liora before they mounted. "You've got more steel in you than silk," she said. "Don't forget that." They rode northwest, the land flattening into open basin. Antelopes scattered at their approach. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow gliding over the sage. As the sky deepened into blue, Yates slowed and pointed toward a bluff where a cluster of stones rose from the grass. "There's a marker up there," he said. "My brother's buried beneath it." Liora didn't speak. She followed him up the slope, dismounting when he did. The wind picked up as they reached the top. The grave was simple, just a wooden cross pressed into the earth, carved initials faded by sun. "He was younger," Yates said. "Fell through a patch of river ice while I was supposed to be watching him." Leora's eyes didn't leave the cross. "I'm sorry," he shook his head. "It was a long time ago, but I come here when I need to remember why I keep moving." They stood together in silence, the breeze tugging at the hem of her skirt. She reached down, picked a wildflower, and laid it at the base of the cross. When they rode on, the quiet between them had a new shape, no longer emptiness, but a tether. By late afternoon, they came upon a small town, a few cabins, a smithy, and a general store with a porch sagging under sacks of dry goods. Yates tied the gelding and handed Liora a $1 coin. "Get yourself something clean," he said. "I'll see about repairs for the saddle." Liora stepped inside, blinking at the dimness. The shopkeep looked up, surprised but polite. She found a calico dress folded on a side shelf, plain but whole. A bar of soap, too. She paid with quiet dignity and stepped into the back to change. When she came out, her hair braided back and the new dress smoothing over her frame, Yates looked up from the porch bench. He stood slowly. "You look ready to begin again," he said. She smiled, small and sure. "Maybe I am." They rode out as the sun dipped westward, the sky streaked with rose and gold. Leora's hand brushed his as they passed the edge of town, and this time he didn't wait for permission. He laced his fingers through hers and held fast. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The wind had changed by morning, cooler now, carrying the distant scent of pine and something faintly metallic, rain, maybe, caught in the high peaks. They followed the slope of the land northward, the trail narrowing between scattered boulders and stands of aspen just beginning to leaf. Liora rode more easily now, her shoulders loose, her gaze quick to catch movement in the brush. They passed a burned-out tree, struck long ago by lightning, its trunk hollowed black. A pair of magpies lifted from its branches as they approached. Liora tilted her face to the sky. "I never saw birds like that in Chicago," she said. "They're loud," Yates answered, reins slack in one hand, "but they know how to stay alive." He didn't say more, and she didn't press. The quiet between them was easier than it had been, companionable, not cautious. Later, they stopped near a stream where the water ran fast over smooth stones. Yates knelt to refill the canteens, and Liora wandered a short stretch downstream, where wild mint grew thick along the bank. She crouched and rubbed a leaf between her fingers, then brought it to her nose. Her voice carried softly over the water. "My mother used to press mint into the windowsills in summer. She said it kept the flies out." Yates stood and watched her from where he was, his boots wet at the toes. "You miss her?" he asked. "I miss who she was before my father's debts hollowed her out." She straightened, brushing her hands on her skirt. "She died in spring. Everything smelled like lilac, but nothing felt alive." Yates didn't fill the silence with comfort. He only nodded once, slow and real, then mounted again and waited for her to join him. They climbed into higher country by dusk, where the land opened wide under the sky and the wind moved in long, sweeping breaths. A hunter's cabin sat tucked between two ridge folds, stone chimney still standing though the roof had given in at the corner. Yates dismounted and studied the place a moment. "It'll hold us for a night," he said. Liora stepped through the sagging doorway and looked around. The air inside was stale with old ash and dry bark, but the hearth was intact. She gathered kindling while he cleared a space near the hearthstone. As the fire caught, she pulled her knees close and stared into the flames. "You ever think about staying somewhere?" she asked. Yates sat across from her, arms resting on his knees. "Sometimes, but I never found a place that felt like it wouldn't spit me back out." "What about a person instead of a place?" He looked at her then, not with surprise, but with something steadier, something rooted. "I think I'm starting to," he said. Liora watched the fire crackle between them. Her voice was low. "The morning you found me, I was ready to lie down and die. I didn't believe help would come." "You didn't lie down," Yates said. "You held on." She reached across the space between them, her hand open. He met it with his own. The firelight caught the calluses along his palm and the curve of her wrist. Neither let go. That night, she lay beside him on a bed of pine boughs and wool. He didn't touch her beyond the warm weight of his arm over her waist, but she felt steadied by it, as though the world had stopped spinning quite so fast. In the morning, they broke camp early. The sky was clear, the air sharp with the promise of summer not far off. They rode west now, toward the edge of the Bitterroot Range, where small settlements dotted the valleys and the rivers ran full. In a hollow near a glacial lake, they came upon a group of Salish traders with packhorses and beadwork spread on blankets. Yates lifted a hand in greeting, and one of the elders stepped forward, his braids silvered at the temples. They spoke in low voices, respectful and brief. Liora waited beside the horses, watching the exchange. When Yates returned, he handed her a pouch of dried huckleberries. "Gift," he said. "For the trail." She held the pouch between her hands. "Why would they give us anything?" "They saw you," he said. "They saw a woman who's walking forward. They camped that night beside the lake, its surface still as glass." Liora stood at the edge, her face reflected in the water. "What do you see?" Yates asked behind her. She turned. "Not who I was, not fully who I'll be yet, either." He stepped beside her. "I see someone worth building something with," her breath caught. "You mean that?" "I mean to stay, if you'll have me." She took his face in her hands, rough, weathered, familiar now. Yes. When he kissed her, it was slow, sure, like the first light cresting over distant hills. In the weeks that followed, they settled into the valley's edge. Yates found work tending cattle for a rancher near the pass, and Liora taught letters to children in a one-room schoolhouse with windows that looked out over fields of yarrow and flax. They built a home with their hands, timber hauled from the ridge, stones from the creek, each board measured and placed with care. Liora planted mint by the door. At night they sat beneath the eaves and listened to the crickets in the grass. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't need to. But always they sat hand in hand. The first frost came early that year, silvering the pasture grass before dawn. Liora woke to the soft hush of it, the way the world seemed to wait before the sun rose. She pulled her shawl tighter and stepped out onto the porch, her bare feet careful on the chilled boards. Yates was already in the field, driving fence posts into the hardening soil. She watched him for a moment, his movements measured, his coat stiff with use, breath clouding in the morning air. He didn't look toward the house, but she knew he'd heard her come out. He always did. Later, she brought him bread wrapped in cloth and a jar of the plum preserves she'd bartered for 2 weeks back. He set down the mallet and took the food without a word, brushing his hand over hers in passing. His palm was rough, but she liked the feel of it, solid, always warm. They sat in the brittle grass, eating with their backs against a stump. The fence ran behind them in a long, straight line, the boards still pale with fresh cut. "You ever think about having a cow or two of your own?" she asked, watching a hawk circle far off. He chewed slowly before answering. "Couldn't keep them fed through winter, not yet, but maybe next year, if we save enough." She nodded, folding the cloth back around the crusts. "I've been thinking about keeping hens, for eggs." Yates looked over at her. "You'd wake before the sun every day." "I already do." He gave a quiet chuckle, then wiped his hands on his trousers. "You'd be good at it. They'd come when you called." "They're not dogs." "No," he said. "But you've got a steady way. Things listen." That night, after the firewood was stacked and the horses fed, Liora brought in a wooden box she'd hidden beneath the bed. She set it on the table and opened it with care, revealing a stack of cloth scraps, a few spools of thread, and a small tin of needles wrapped in oilcloth. Yates glanced over from where he sat near the hearth. "What's that?" "This," she said, smoothing a deep blue square, "was part of my mother's apron. I kept it." He didn't say anything, only watched as she picked through the pieces. "I want to make a quilt," she said, "from bits that mattered. Things we wore or used or brought here." He stood and crossed to her, running his fingers along the edges of the cloth. That's a good way to remember. I'm not making it for remembering, she said, looking up. I'm making it for staying. For making this a place that holds. His hand found the back of her neck, thumb resting at the base of her hairline. Then we'll fill it with what we've built. The winter settled in with long shadows and snow that came in slow, persistent drifts. Liora mended coats and stitched the first blocks of the quilt by lamplight. While Yates carved a cradle from pine he'd split himself. He didn't say much as he worked, but she saw it the way his hand lingered at her waist when he passed her, the way he counted the months in silence when he thought she wasn't watching. They never spoke of fear. They didn't have to. It sat in the corners sometimes, like the cold, but never stayed long. One evening, Yates came in with his lashes dusted white and a letter held tight in his gloved hand. He laid it on the table without a word. Liora peeled it open carefully. Her fingers stilled when she reached the final lines. "My cousin," she said, voice thin. "She's alive, in Missoula. She made it west after all." Yates pulled out chair and sat across from her. "You want to go see her?" She looked toward the window where the wind moved heavy against the glass. "I think I want her to know I'm not lost," he nodded. "We'll ride out first thaw." She reached for him then, not just his hand, but his whole presence leaning into the space they'd made together, the one that didn't need explaining. "I was never meant to do this alone," she said. "You're not," he answered. The weeks passed. The cradle stood finished in the corner, lined with wool and stitched linen. Leora's belly grew slow and certain, and Yates moved with a new kind of stillness, always watching, always ready. When the snow began to melt from the eaves, Liora planted the first row of beans in the thawing ground, her hands cold but sure. Yates built a coop from broken fence boards, and by the end of March, 4 hens scratched in the yard. One morning they stood at the edge of the field, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun rise clean over the hills. "You remember that dry creek?" she asked softly. He nodded. "I think about her, the woman I was then. I think she'd be glad I stayed upright. She'd be glad you reached for something," he said, "and found it." They didn't move for a long time, the light pouring over them, soft and gold. Then Yates took her hand in his, and without a word they walked back toward the house together. Always. Yates came in from the barn with a cut across his knuckles and a dampness clinging to his coat. The April thaw had turned the pasture into a stretch of stubborn mud, and one of the steers had broken through the fence again. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and flexed his hand once, then twice, before reaching for the kettle Liora had left warming on the hearth. "You'll need to soak that," she said, not looking up from the cloth she was folding. "It's already swelling." He glanced down. "It's not bad. It's bleeding through the wrap." He didn't argue, just sat on the bench and let her bring the basin of warm water. She knelt by him, dipping a square of linen into the steam and dabbing gently. "You carve the cradle, dig the post holes, mend the tack, and still you won't ask for help when a steer charges you." I didn't expect him to bolt. "You say that every time." He gave a small, lopsided grin, quiet and crooked. "You keeping a tally now? I'm keeping you in one piece." She rinsed the cloth again and pressed it lightly to the gash. His hand stayed still in hers, heavy and warm. "I heard from the schoolhouse," she said after a moment. "They want me to teach full-time come autumn." Yates looked up. "You want to?" "I think I do." She sat back on her heels. "Not just letters. They want someone who can keep the children steady, especially after last winter. It's not just sums and reading, it's helping them grow their roots." "You'd be good at that," she met his eyes. "There'd be a small pay." "Enough to add a room onto the house if we're careful." Yates nodded slowly. "We can build it after the harvest. I'll draw the plans." Outside, the wind had settled. The hens scratched through the yard and the scent of damp soil drifted through the open window. By late May, the land had softened, and the first shoots of corn pushed through the rows behind the cabin. Liora worked the garden early, her sleeves rolled and her hem tucked up to the calves. Yates repaired the last of the saddle straps and started sketching the addition they'd talked about. He measured the beams with care, using the same pencil Liora had once used to mark the first pages of her ledger. One afternoon, they rode out with a cart hooked behind the mare, bound for Missoula by way of the southern pass. Leora's cousin, Miriam, met them at the edge of the settlement, her hands dusted with flour and her apron streaked with berry stains. She hugged Liora long and tight, then turned to Yates with a nod that said she understood more than she let on. They stayed 3 nights. Miriam's husband, a wiry man named Josiah, showed Yates the new irrigation channels he was digging, and the 2 men spent more time talking over soil and seed than anyone expected. On the last night, as Liora and Miriam sat in the yard watching the stars rise above the pines, Liora turned to her. "I didn't think I'd have anything like this again." Miriam leaned back against the porch rail. "You didn't find it, you built it." They rode home slow, the cart lighter, the air full of pine smoke and the hum of insects. Yates reached for Leora's hand once the cabin came into sight, weathered and steady on the ridge. "I've been thinking," he said. She glanced over. "You ever want to marry me proper, you only have to say." Liora blinked once, then smiled without hesitation. "You ever want to ask me proper, you only have to try." He stopped the cart right there in the road and turned to her. "Liora Hale, will you marry me before the end of this summer under that cottonwood where we first planted?" She didn't hesitate. Yes, they married in August, under a sky as wide as any they'd ever seen. Ruthie Baird came down from the hills with a loaf of her honey bread and a string of wildflowers, and Miriam arrived with a basket of pies and tears in her eyes. The preacher from the neighboring valley read words that drifted soft on the breeze, and Yates held Leora's hands like they were the only thing anchoring him to the world. Afterward, they danced in the field behind the house, with lanterns strung between fence posts and fiddle music rising from the porch. The neighbors brought jars of preserves, skeins of wool, and crates of apples. No one brought money, no one needed to. They built the new room together, timber by timber, and by winter it was full of warmth and the scent of cedar and beeswax. Leora's quilt hung over the bed, stitched with pieces of their days, her apron, his old work shirt, a faded square of the dress she wore the day they met. When the baby came the next spring, she was strong and loud, with eyes that settled quickly on her father's face. They named her Clara, after Leora's mother, and wrapped her in a shawl Ruthie had woven by hand. On the mornings that followed, Yates would lift Clara from her cradle and carry her to the porch where Liora waited with coffee and a wool blanket. They would sit in the silence before the world woke, the baby nestled between them, and watch the light spill over the hills. "I didn't know a heart could hold this much," Liora said once, her voice low. Yates kissed her temple, his fingers tracing the curve of her hand. "It can when it's earned," and they stayed. Through each season's turn, through lean months and laughter, they stayed. The cabin held against every storm, and the love that built it never faltered. They grew old in that house. They taught their daughter to read the land and trust her voice. They watched her ride out into the world and come home again, always knowing where her roots ran deep. And every morning, as long as they could, Yates and Liora sat side by side on the porch, hands folded together, watching the sun rise over the land they had made their own. Not because it had been given to them, but because they had chosen it just as they had chosen each other. And never once did they look back.